You're listening to the World Soccer Talk podcast, the only podcast about watching soccer on TV and online. Welcome to episode 173. Coming up on this week's show, Bundesliga brings the noise, LaLiga announces ambitious plans for their return, why MLS is skating on thin ice financially, how TV piracy may scupper the Newcastle takeover plans, NWSL is back again. Plus, we have letters from you, the listeners, in our mailbag section. I'm Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, and I'm joined alongside my co-host, Kartik Krishnaiyer. For those listeners tuning in that haven't listened to this podcast before, this is really a deep dive into watching soccer on television. So everything from talking about the commentating, the broadcasting, the programming selections, the coverage, the halftime analysis, if there is any. Basically kind of a global view of diehard soccer fans, but also even digging deeper into a lot of the business and politics about watching soccer, who has the rights, who are the rights going to, and who are the players in the streaming side, who are the companies that look like they're going to be, the acquiring more rights to some of these properties that we used to watch on television a lot more. So a lot of that. And Kartik, so let's dive in. We're going to change things up a little bit in this episode. So rather than going into what we've been watching, which I'm sure for you and for me and probably most of the listeners is Bundesliga crazy, which is awesome. We'll get to that in a little while. That's definitely great news, and there's a lot of fantastic things to talk about there. But before we get to that, Kartik, and I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here, and that is that pretty soon, La Liga is going to be back, and pretty soon the Premier League is going to be back, among other leagues. And I think in many ways the Bundesliga has put down a blueprint. They've been a pioneer in how to bring back soccer and make it work in terms of everything from the kind of the health setup in terms of from the medical side, making sure that the testing, the availability, making sure the players are in these hotels where they're not going to be interacting with the public, etc., playing games behind closed doors. They've done everything right. I think this has been a blueprint, not just for the Premier League and La Liga, but for other leagues from around the world. And I think, though, too, with the Bundesliga, the Germans are very stubborn in some ways in terms of the broadcast times. And now we have La Liga looking to come back around about June 11th. That's the latest date. And the Premier League looking to come back around about June 19th. That's their latest date. I think they're going to take all the best ideas that the Germans have done and run with it and make it more TV friendly as far as kickoff times, make it more of a TV focus, and probably take a lot of the credit. And then the Bundesliga will continue to grow slowly but surely. But I think it's going to be La Liga and the Premier League that's going to step right in and take off, and who knows what those numbers will be like. I would imagine they'd be much greater for that than for the Bundesliga. What do you think, Kartik?
I think both those leagues have significant hurdles in even if they start their seasons to finishing their seasons that maybe the Bundesliga doesn't have, in that the coronavirus pandemic health situation in both of those countries is significantly worse than Germany. It's a little bit now more under control in both places, particularly in Spain. But I think that's an obstacle. We can look at abstract dates on a piece of paper and say, oh, great, the La Liga is going to be back and they're going to have all these match days. I'm concerned, obviously, by the number of positive tests we have in the Premier League. I'm concerned about restarts in general. I'm just not terribly comfortable with it. But the Bundesliga has done a very good job. I'm sure once the Premier League restarts, though, being the Premier League, they will have the highest numbers globally, and they will take the credit. And there will be very little acknowledgement of what else goes on. Something to watch with this, though, is that the Football League in England, League 2 has been canceled. League 1 is on the precipice of being canceled, and or on the cusp of being canceled. The championship, I think, is very contingent on what the Premier League decides to do, not as far as restarting, when they restart, but how they decide to finish their season with relegation in terms of just how that plays out. So that's another thing to watch. I do not think the championship can come back until the Premier League has determined a competition format. So we're looking probably at July for that, if they come back.
Yeah, and the latest, again, this is on paper, this is from the EFL, but the latest for the Championship is June 20th. So coming back the same weekend, actually the day after the Premier League. And again, all these dates are TBD until... A lot of it depends on the training, getting these teams and these athletes back up and running. But I think what the Germans have done extremely well is having that controlled environment. And that's my fear for the Premier League and also for La Liga is, are the players going to stick to that controlled environment as well as the German players or the players from around the world who play in the Bundesliga in Germany? I have some of my doubts on that. But if you look at the numbers, Kartik, I think for the Premier League, the testing that they did recently, I think was last week, there were less than 5 players out of 700 and something that tested positive. La Liga, it was, I think, exactly 5. And those 5 athletes had asymptomatic, results. So I think they were surprised that they had it. But that's my optimistic outlook, is that as long as players can go by the rules, stay within the guidelines, stay within these controlled environments, that it is possible to bring these back.
I think there's two concerns here in terms of the Premier League. One, we had a couple more positive tests yesterday. Secondly, coronavirus has been a case of football and footballers behaving badly, at least in society's eyes. I think much of it has been overblown, exaggerated by the media. But there is a state of, it's very funny. I was thinking about this yesterday. The United States is a society where right now everybody is live and let live and being individualistic and breaking rules and flaunting it. Whereas in the United Kingdom, it's become a society of snitches, for lack of a better term, right? And we see that even in the whole Dominic Cummings fiasco, if you follow politics. So there has been a image hit to football during the coronavirus in England specifically, which we have not seen in other countries. There has been a overplaying of every player who's gone out to a nightclub or broken curfew. Now, one in Callum Hudson-Odoi has behaved horribly and is rightfully being punished, but or will rightfully be punished.
What about Kyle Walker?
But guys like Kyle Walker breaking curfew, that was really overblown in the media. Whether he broke the rules clearly, and there are some other examples of that. In addition, I think that there has been a general view in society that football as an entity, footballers wouldn't take pay cuts the way people wanted, the general public wanted, and football owners and regulatory bodies, including the Premier League, Football League, and FA, all got a lot of shtick from the public during March and April. So I think England is in a very different position than, let's say, Spain, where I don't think there's been as much backlash, or Italy, and certainly Germany, there wasn't. So this is a big test for the Premier League in terms of regaining the public's confidence domestically. Internationally, everyone loves the Premier League, right? But I think in the domestic market, not just the Premier League, football in general, football has taken a black eye during coronavirus in England, for rightly or wrongly. I mean, I think a lot of it has been overblown, but there's definitely been a backlash against the game.
Yeah, so from the media's point of view, in terms of it being overblown, I can see that, but probably because there's more of an industry as far as newspapers and Sky Sports News, and trying to make a story out of nothing, or just trying to make a story out of anything. And you've got this huge industry that for the last 3 months have had really nothing to report on. Transfer rumors out the window, fantasy football out the window, football matches and the coverage of those games out the window. So they've been gravitating to anything they can get their hands on. So I think there's more, in some ways, the footballers' lives are more under the microscope than even before, perhaps, because there's nothing else for the media to focus on. But going back to the Premier League and La Liga for a second, Kartik, their TV plans. So these are, again, not completely finalized yet. When we're recording this podcast right now on Thursday, we should get more details out within the next 24 hours about the plans. But what we know so far, it's going to be a TV bonanza. I mean, in terms of from the viewer's point of view, once these leagues do return to play, the Premier League is looking at doing basically games Saturdays, Sundays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. The Saturday and Sunday block, now this is Eastern Time, United States, there'll be 10 hours of back-to-back coverage. So games will be at 7 a.m., 9 a.m. Eastern, 11 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. So from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, 10 hours on both Saturdays and Sundays. All of those games will happen from, staggered kickoffs. So if you're NBCSN, you've got 10 hours guaranteed of coverage. And some of those games probably on NBC, over-the-air network. And then with the midweek games, the Tuesdays and Wednesdays, they're looking at 1 p.m. kickoffs and 3 p.m. kickoffs. So again, back-to-back staggered matches. So you got 4 hours on Tuesdays, 4 hours on Wednesdays. La Liga is looking to have matches every single day of the week. So on weekends, Eastern Time, they'll have 3 games kicking off at 11 a.m. Eastern, 1:30, and then 3:30. So there you have like 6 hours of coverage. And then weekday games will be kicking off Spanish time in the evening at nighttime just because of the heat and humidity. But the games will be played, shown live on beIN Sports. Kickoff times are around about 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, depending on when they actually finalize that. So what the Bundesliga's done, which has done an incredible job of really figuring out how to do all of this, and being stubborn in that they don't like changing kickoff times, even when there's no fans in the stadiums, even when there's, if at any time in the future of the Bundesliga they could change the kickoff times, this would have been it. They've kind of stuck to pretty much the same times that they've had before. And then I think, and like I said before too, I think the Premier League and La Liga are looking at a TV bonanza here. The question I have, Kartik, is do you think the fans will return to watching these games at the same numbers as before?
On television?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Premier League numbers... Look, we've seen the Premier League numbers have been... critics would say, including a lot of MLS backers, that, they're stagnant. They haven't really grown in the U.S. the last few years. Similarly, they haven't really declined in the U.S. at a time when sports numbers for sports in general are going down or have been going down. That's pre-coronavirus. The television ratings for sports, there have been exceptions, right? Tiger Woods won the Masters. He was in contention until the 17th hole of the British Open the year before, the Open Championship. So there have been some spikes here and there when there have been these sort of thing. Serena Williams was in the final of God, I can't even remember which Grand Slam tournament now. It's been so long. But yeah, so there have been these spikes, right? But generally, sports numbers have gone down over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. And the Premier League numbers have been very stagnant. You hear critics say, they haven't grown, right? And NBC was counting on all this growth. At the same time, nothing else has grown. So I think they'll be the same. Now, La Liga, there's the issue of distribution again in the United States. And the question is, how many people, Chris, who had beIN or had Fubo, beIN via Fubo, via Sling, via whatever, prior to this pandemic, now have a financial crunch and have canceled the service? That, I think, is a big question as far as La Liga's numbers. And the unemployment rate, the kind of economic suffering, it's bad everywhere, but it's worse in the United States than it is in Western Europe. So I have that question. I mean, the beIN issue, unfortunately, is one we cannot get away from when we're talking about La Liga.
Yeah, but I think it's always going to be there because there's still, well, actually, in some ways, I mean, in terms of people having cable and satellite and those numbers of people cutting the cord there and saying, okay, I'm done with cable, I'm done with satellite. Those numbers, I think the first quarter of 2020 was 1.8 million people cut the cord from those services. So many of them are gravitating towards your Sling TV, your YouTube TV, etc. So some of the streaming platforms we know very well. And And then you've got some people that cut the cord that didn't go to a streaming service but have access to over-the-air television. So you're over-the-air NBC or you're over-the-air, I don't know, ABC or whatever it may be. So if those games are going to be on over-the-air television, some of those games from the Premier League, they're okay. With LaLiga, LaLiga, that's going to hurt them in terms of not having any over-the-air delivery method. But I think in some ways, though, too, I mean, I don't know, with beIN Sports, it is one of those things that if you want beIN Sports, it's easy to get. If you want La Liga soccer, it's easy to get. So Fanatis, which is like, $8 a month, you can get all the beIN Sports channels, including the Connect channels, plus Gold TV and a whole bunch of other channels for $8 a month. So to me, the beIN Sports distribution is always an issue as long as they don't have access to, as long as Comcast and DirecTV do not have them on there. That is always going to be an issue, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. But if you really want it, you can get it. But yeah, I think I agree with you, Kartik, in terms of the numbers. I think they'll be just as strong as they were before, and who knows? I mean, this is the big test. Is with that, 10 hours of coverage on a Saturday or a Sunday. Is that an opportunity for NBC to promote that like crazy, which they will, especially when there's no other sports on? How will those numbers do in terms of your casual sports fan? The casual sports fan has really not been tuning in to watch the Bundesliga, which is their problem. That's they're missing out. Whether or not maybe with the Premier League, maybe it'll be more accessible because it's in English and it's easier to kind of for people to gravitate towards that where there's that common language.
Another big question is, I got a lot of feedback when I said, look, I think that it's too early because of health concerns for all these leagues to be coming back. I got a lot of surprising feedback, and again, it's by no means scientific, but this is between Facebook and Twitter and social media, of people who said, you know what, we're diehard sports fans, we're Chicago Bulls fans, or whatever. They were watching that documentary, right? And we haven't really missed sports the way we thought we would. We kind of have liked a break to focus on our families and do some reading and focus on other aspects of society, watch movies, etc. Probably watch Netflix. Now, June 19th is very different than May 15th or 16th when the Bundesliga came back. So that's an additional month where those people might say, you know what, I really do miss sports. So that might play in the Premier League's advantage, in addition to the accessibility of being on NBC over the air, as we presume many of these games will be. As they always are. They show 34 matches a year on NBC. It might end up being more this season, 34 matches a season versus Fox's tepid commitment to the Bundesliga, which we'll get to when we review what we watch this week. And so it could actually really play in the Premier League's favor that people will hit that point where they're now hankering for sports to come back. Premier League will come back. Let's presume June 19th is the date that they're able to stick to that. And then you have NWSL the following week. It could be really a good time for soccer. Now, the other question is if the ratings that we've seen for NASCAR, which haven't been as great as maybe some people expected, and then obviously Bundesliga we've talked about, if that's an indicator of this lag continuing. Or is it, again, the Fox effect? We don't know.
Yeah, we will find out, right, Kartik? We will find out in the next few weeks. And again, some great data points I'm sure will be coming through, and we'll be talking about them in coming weeks. And before we get to the Bundesliga, just one more thing too, Kartik, is that coming up a little bit later in the news section, we'll be talking about a lot of the great news that's happening within the industry about watching games and more leagues coming online. But one of the things we'll talk about too is Major League Soccer and the position that they're in right now, and whether it is a positive or a negative financially. So we'll get to that in a little while. But Kartik, you mentioned the Bundesliga and fans, just people in general, the public, doing other things, like, riding bikes, watching Netflix, going to the beach, whatever it may be, or staying indoors and doing gardening, whatever it is. I was shocked. Absolutely shocked. Maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked at the number of people on Tuesday that were tuning in to the Bayern Munich against Dortmund Klassiker, who are saying like, and these are people that are like, I thought were like hardcore US soccer fans, but the number of people are saying like, oh my gosh, like what's this thing about the crowd noise? Like as if it was a brand new thing that had just happened that day, and that was the very first game that was doing the artificial crowd noise. And I'm like, where were you over the weekend when all these games were happening and the Mines game had the artificial crowd noise? I was surprised by that, Carter, because I thought, again, to me and you, I think we're different than, say, well, we're different than everyone, but to me, if it's soccer on television, I don't care what soccer it is. If it's Major League Soccer, USL, NASL, Bundesliga, whatever it may be, I will watch it. I mean, I've watched the Belarus Premier League. I've watched, you name it. I will watch it and I will enjoy it. But I was shocked at how many people have not been watching the Bundesliga, even soccer fans.
Yeah, but that matchup is always a matchup that gets crossover appeal, right? I mean, there was even one year Fox did move the game to FX because there was a lot of criticisms of the game not being on over the air Fox, as you remember. That was the year Christian Pulisic broke through at Dortmund and Thomas Tuchel was the manager. There is, I think, an awareness the Bundesliga is playing, but at the same time, people are kind of their lives have changed, right? I mean, and I know it's only been 2 months or 2.5 months of lockdown and now phased kind of reopening in the U.S. UK is a little different, as we've talked about, but that I think that people fundamentally kind of their daily routine has changed, and they're not into getting up in the morning and watching soccer, football. I mean, that having been said, the Bundesliga ratings haven't been terrible. Maybe they haven't met our expectations. But then this specific match, always gets crossover people, people who watch other leagues, people who are soccer fans in general, and I think there's also. And I dealt with this, maybe I'll get into this later, this growing feedback from U.S. soccer fans who want to put down some of these players for whatever reason, and they're tuning in and they're making comments and they're reacting to things I'm saying on Twitter that are favorable about other North American about the North American players currently in the Bundesliga. So it's a very odd thing. But the thing I have noticed though is that your soccer media, Chris, the people who generally did not pay attention to the Bundesliga when it was on at the same time as the Premier League, and I guess it's a soccer media everywhere, because in the U.S. we have had a contingent of people who watch the Bundesliga almost out of spite for the Premier League, right? Yeah. There's been a few of those through the years because they don't like the Premier League, and so they will deliberately very kind of very openly at when the games are running concurrently tweet about Bundesliga matches. There has been a spike in media interest in this league. There's no two ways about it. Yeah. So now, does that change how the media will cover leagues in Europe going forward? I think it's possible. I also do think, though, that there is always the problem of when these leagues come back, people then just focusing on the Premier League or whatever domestic league they prefer. And without European competition, we don't have a resumption date for that yet. The president of Lyon said it was going to be August 3rd. His team is obviously done for the season because Ligue 1 canceled their season. Without European competition, there's really little incentive for media to watch other leagues. And that's always been a big thing. I've always been very critical of the media in Britain in particular, that they have a lack of knowledge of the continental leagues. But then they tend to always want to watch Bayern or Juventus or Real Madrid when they can, because they think there'll be threats in European competition for British clubs. Mm-hmm. Without that, currently, they may not even bother after June 19th.
Yeah, I think in many ways, though, for me, I was just surprised about people who I thought were like really massive soccer fans did not tune in for the other Bundesliga games, and they were only tuning in for really kind of only started tuning in for the Dortmund Bayern game. But I get it though in many ways, because I mean those big games, if it's, I don't know, Manchester Derby or Manchester United against Liverpool or Arsenal against Spurs, I mean people gravitate to those teams, those big derbies or there's big games between some of the massive clubs, and that's going to attract more of the who I thought were passionate hardcore fans, but are more maybe soccer casual type of fans. But what the Bundesliga has done, Kartik, in the last 2 weeks, it's an incredible primer. So for myself included, so I've been watching Bundesliga for years, but I've watched more Bundesliga in the last 2 weeks than I think I've ever done. Because I've grown to appreciate it even more than before. I've grown to know the commentators more intimately in terms of their names and which ones are better than others and which styles I like, and learning more about their backgrounds too, and doing some research and looking into that. But this is the perfect primer for ESPN Plus and for ESPN for next season, is that I think everyone that walks away from this season, once it does end, which will be over before you know it, by the time that the Premier League and La Liga is getting ready to kick off, the Bundesliga will be almost done probably, is giving us a primer. So it's probably increased, even among the hardcore, it's probably increased our knowledge base just a little bit more. And among the casuals, the ones that would tune in now and again, maybe they're tuning in a little bit more. Maybe they know more about Hertha Berlin, or maybe they know more about the different players, and not just the American stars, but the different players throughout the clubs and the history. There's a lot to love. Kartik, from this past weekend of Bundesliga coverage, let's start here. Has there been any negatives at all? Is there anything that you can criticize? Has there been anything that you kind of like, I can't believe that just happened? TV coverage or on the pitch?
No, I think actually this weekend was better. These last two match days, actually the weekend match days, in terms of providing surprises. My observation, which most people didn't pick up, and I think I tried to say a dozen times and most people still didn't get it, was that first match day was remarkably to form. I mean, I was stunned that after a 2-month break, Schalke and Eintracht continued to play as poorly as they were before the break. Mönchengladbach, Leverkusen, and Dortmund continued to play as well as they did before the break, and Bremen was as bad as they were before the break. Now what's happened in these last two match days is there are all kinds of random results, right? I mean, the idea of Wolfsburg going to Leverkusen and smashing them and Mönchengladbach drawing Bremen, some really odd results. So that's positive. So now the randomness of results in the Bundesliga that we've enjoyed for many, many years, and then suddenly this year, the Bundesliga has been very top-heavy. I'll be honest with you. It's what I've criticized the Premier League for in the past, where there's this huge gap between 6th and 7th or 5th and 6th in the Premier League. We now have in the Bundesliga. We've had in the Bundesliga this season. Suddenly, these two match days in front of closed doors and all the other things going with this restart have mixed it up. There's more randomization. We have a relegation race suddenly with Düsseldorf playing well. I mean, if Düsseldorf hadn't blown those 2 points late against Cologne, they'd be out of the drop zone, or they'd be out of the playoff drop zone, and Mainz would be in it. Things that we did not think were probably going to happen if the season had continued in mid-March. So that's really good. Another thing I want to put out there, Phil Boney is now the new Martin Tyler in terms of presence, because we're all watching the Bundesliga. Want to give a lot of credit to Ian Joy, who we obviously have a lot of time for on this show, and one of our favorites. Ian Joy told me months ago, I think it was the beginning of this season, I think, said, hey, you're such a Bundesliga guy. Why aren't you following this guy on Twitter? Why aren't you paying more attention to him? And so I did, and he is kind of like that Martin Tyler, John Champion type voice that we associated with the Premier League for the Bundesliga, and really grown in appreciation of him, and he has been phenomenal since the restart, as have all the commentators. Bundesliga commentators, this is another thing, are really, really knowledgeable. The commentators and the co-commentators. Sometimes in the Premier League, we watch the international feed when NBC doesn't give us the Arlo White, Graham Lasso, Lee Dixon, their native call, and we're thinking, this commentator's not as good as we thought. And then in the Champions League, it happens all the time, right? Where we complain about the commentators. So that's been another thing from the television perspective. The only negative for me has been that anytime I try and favorably talk about Alphonso Davies, MLS product, who's just been phenomenal for Bayern Munich, or any American player like Tyler Adams or Weston McKennie, who scored yesterday for Schalke, Timmy Chandler, who's been really good for Eintracht most of the season, I get this pushback on Twitter from the people who I complained about earlier in the year when we were talking about Chelsea, the Pulisic police, so to speak, who are these kind of like American exceptional U.S. national team fans. Most of them are anti-MLS. That's where the Davies thing comes in. And he's also Canadian, let's keep in mind. Or even if they're pro-MLS, they're like pro-Pulisic. And so I got all kinds of pushback. I didn't mention Pulisic at all when I talked about how great Alphonso Davies was. And I got tons of pushback about Pulisic is better and, Davies is just on a better team. And that's why you think he's so good. And that might also be a Canadian-American thing. And then also mentioned Gio Reyna. And my Gio Reyna saying I think Gio Reyna is ahead of Pulisic at this point when they are both at Dortmund at the same age was a comment not about player v. player. It was actually manager v. manager saying, hey, I think Lucien Favre is much better in terms of details and getting a guy to position himself properly and read the game well out of possession than Tuchel, who I think is just like a manager who likes to attack recklessly. And then the recklessness we see in Pulisic's game, all the bad giveaways, all the problems he had at Chelsea early on, I think are more a reflection of Tuchel's management and Tuchel's development style than anything else. But that nuance was missed on people. They thought I was taking a shot at Pulisic again and went crazy. So that's been the only negative for me, but everything else has been positive.
Yeah, and in past episodes, Kartik, I can almost guarantee that even this episode, we'll get comments on social media saying like, yeah, you guys are like basically criticizing Pulisic again. And it's not.
What is it about this guy? I don't get it because I'm praising other American players.
Well, I think part of it is the inferiority complex. But part of it is kind of the US Canadian divide. If he was American, it would be not front page news, but it would be a completely different viewpoint of the player. And it is one of those things. I think a lot of people don't realize. Some of these are journalists though, but a lot of these people don't realize that they have blinders on. And Pulisic is a fantastic player, has shown a lot of promise. Has had injury problems, and it has been inconsistent. When he's on, he's on. When he's off, he's off. And with Davies, it's consistently good. It's consistently incredible. It's the speed.
Just the way he even reads the game. You saw it in the Dortmund game, right?
Yeah.
The Bayern Dortmund game. The number of times he was in the right place at the right time. He does have the pace to close down, which is a gift, but his reading of the game is exceptional. And this is the thing, Chris, I think maybe there is that inferiority complex because imagine if he were American. Now, obviously, MLS can pound their chest and say, we developed this guy. The thing is, though, he's a Canadian. If he was American, it would be front page news at this point. If you had this American breakthrough star who would come through the youth system in the country. So it's I guess it's unfortunate. We were waiting for that breakthrough star at a huge club in global football, and it happened with a Canadian before an American, and that's pretty shocking. Now let's see if Davies continues this, but I see no indications that he lets up. In fact, I think you and I had an exchange on Facebook where you talked about Bayern having no weaknesses, and I said, yeah, that's true. It's unfortunate. Those of you who don't know, every year around this time, or not this time, but it would be 2 months earlier normally, I get my hopes up that Dortmund can win the title, and then reality smacks me in the face when they play one another. Mm-hmm. And this time the margin was much thinner, right? It wasn't the 5-0 that we've seen in the past in these sorts of matches.
Yeah.
So the thing that was the difference, I think, for Bayern is Davies, because they had Alaba playing left back. He wasn't really the best at covering when he would go forward. And then they had a real weakness at center back. Boateng is long in the tooth. We saw him make some mistakes in this game, by the way. Mm-hmm. And Lucas Hernandez, I don't rate as a Bayern-level defender, even though I know he's a World Cup winner for France, whatever. Having Davies play left back has allowed Alaba to go to center back where he can focus on his defending, and he's been very good. He's been an upgrade over Hernandez there. And they have a better left back in Davies. So the hole that could have been exploited by a Sancho, a Brandt, and a Thorgan Hazard, who had a very good game at times on Tuesday, has been scuttled by Davies. Davies' introduction into the lineup for Bayern has made them arguably the best team in Europe. That's how good this guy is. Wow. And they were struggling before when Kovac was still the manager. People point to the managerial switch. But he coming in, and then obviously Hansi Flick also moved Mueller back to his natural position. Those are the two things. And one of them has a North American storyline. The other question is, Chris, why hasn't MLS exploited the Davies thing? If he was an American, you know what they'd be doing right now? We'd be getting it in our inbox every day from MLS media, right?
Right.
If this was an American. So this is why, again, I mean, a lot of Canadians have told me through the years, I've talked about the natural kind of governance issues with cross-border leagues, and that's my experience from working the NASL. That was very difficult, and I think Canada should have their own football system, and they can look after their own that way. Some of Canadian journalists have come back at me and said it's actually more than that. They agree with me on that, but we will never be properly promoted and properly talked about if our teams are tied to U.S. leagues. And I've always thought, no. When I worked at the NASL, I always talked about Montreal and Edmonton. I always promoted Ottawa. But this is a clear case of it. I mean, if this were an American player, MLS rightly would be saying, hey, we developed this guy. Hey, New York Times. Hey, L.A., Chicago Tribune, et cetera.
Right.
But unfortunately, it's a Canadian guy.
Yeah, it is quite different. I mean, that cross-border, that border makes a huge difference. I mean, if it was the United States of North America and you had Canada as part of the United States, it'd be a completely different story. But going back to something else you said a minute ago, Kartik, and that was about Phil Bonney. Listeners, if you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to the podcast that Nate Abarea did, it's been about 45 minutes to an hour interviewing Phil Bonney, learning his backstory, which is really interesting. And Phil loves to talk. I mean, so it's a great in-depth interview, getting to know the personality a little bit better of Phil Bonney. I'd recommend that highly. But the other person I've really tapped into these last few weeks, Kartik, and really grown to appreciate even more is one of the co-commentators, and that's Thomas Broich. And this is somebody, to me, whenever I hear him speak and analyze the games, he reminds me a lot of Rafa Honigstein, someone who's very articulate, somebody that's very intelligent, somebody who's able to talk about in detail about tactics or players or history or backstory. I mean, there's so many great co-commentators and commentators from this league. We could probably spend the next 20 minutes talking about them all. But Thomas has stood out for me as Phil has stood out for you.
Yeah, I would also mention that that Rafa Honigstein, you mentioned him now being property of The Athletic and not on ESPN FC has really opened this door for Don Hutchinson, who I think a lot of people remember as a Premier League midfielder, to kind of become this resident expert on German football at ESPN. So that's another kind of knock-on effect of The Athletic and everything. We're going to talk about The Athletic in a little bit also in relation to MLS. But I keep an eye on Don Hutchinson. I think he's really elevated himself even before the COVID break, but especially now that the Bundesliga is the only game in town.
So, Kartik, we're 35 minutes into this podcast, and we haven't talked about the big topic that everyone's been talking about, and that is the artificial crowd noise. And this was something, if we go back into the tapes from just about, 3 months ago, when we were having games, Europa League games, being played behind closed doors. We had Liga MX games being played behind closed doors. And I think both of you and I agreed that, while it was interesting listening to the players and the coaches, you needed to have some sound piped in somehow. Little did I know that the Bundesliga would take it to, the top level. This is even better than what I could have imagined. I know a lot of listeners are against it, but personally, to me, it adds so much better atmosphere. It adds the excitement levels. But the way that the Bundesliga has been able to do this, and it is the Bundesliga, what they're doing is offering a audio feed to broadcasters worldwide. They can pick and choose between, okay, do you want to take the commentary and then just the stadium sounds, or do you want the commentary with the audio enhanced artificial crowd noise? And Fox and I think a few others around the world did. The majority of them are still going with just the solo commentary or the commentary and the real noise from the stadium. But oh my gosh, the Bundesliga have done such an incredible job. Everything from, I mean, the Bayern Dortmund game is a great example. I mean, anytime that the ball went back to Manuel Neuer, you had the artificial crowd noise with whistles and kind of boos. Whenever Bayern had possession, you'd get the whistles and boos a little bit, and as the ball went back to Dortmund, I mean, the crowd noise would go up a little bit. I mean, whoever's actually doing this in real time is a legend. I mean, absolutely fantastic job that they've done, and it helps. It helps accentuate and enhance the actual TV broadcast. I love it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. To be honest with you, it gave me a more comfortable feeling, a more natural feeling watching these matches, because I think listening to the players' emotions and all of that, that's kind of neat in a way, and as a one-off or a two-off. And I've been at many matches here in the U.S. that I've worked at. It might as well be behind closed doors, right? Because you've had a couple hundred fans, and you can hear all that, and there's a certain thrill to that. But when you get to bigger matches, you want the crowd noise, and I think for the Der Klassiker, it was really well done, and it gave me, as I said, a comfortable feeling and the edge of my seat feeling. And I think I've mentioned this earlier, and people who follow me on Twitter have known this for years. I have a fondness for Borussia Dortmund, so I'm on the edge of my seat, and I'm feeling more alive, if you will, and more encouraged because they are piping that noise in. So thank you to Fox for picking up that feed, first of all.
Yep.
But then also, I think it enhanced my viewing experience. Now, for some people, it might be the opposite. People who are less invested or whatever, they liked what they heard with the lack of crowd noise the first week back, or they think it's inauthentic. But I loved it. I'm in complete agreement with you. And it gave me more emotion in that match. I mean, that match was very emotional for me as it stands, as I think people who follow me on social media know. I was very unhappy, very upset about it. But that was a really good touch from the Bundesliga. And every little thing, this is something maybe our listeners and general soccer fans in the country are learning if they haven't followed the Bundesliga closely. Every little thing the Bundesliga does in terms of television production and these little kind of detail-oriented stuff is really good compared to other leagues. They get things right, and they very rarely blow it. So this is another nice touch and another template for the Premier League, for La Liga, for Serie A if they ever restart, which I doubt. But for those other leagues.
Yeah, the other game too. I mean, on Sunday morning was the Cologne Dusseldorf game, and having the crowd noise, the artificial crowd noise for the comeback and the late equalizer, and just in combination with the commentary too. It's not replacing the commentary by any means, but the commentary plus the artificial crowd noise and just the craziness of the fans celebrating, just hearing that noise was perfect. It really added to the emotions of watching the game, and yeah, I just can't believe how good of a job they've done. The other thing I like about it too, Kartik, is that it's very anonymous. So when it started on Sunday morning, which was the first time I heard it, which was the Mainz RB Leipzig game, I was thinking, okay, is it going to be German chants? Is it going to be, I don't know, here we go, Mainz, here we go. But it's always anonymous. You mean these, which just makes it easier to produce that sound. But it's never right to that club where they're playing those songs. But even in some of the games too, I think it might have been the Mainz Leipzig game, you were hearing cowbells. So I don't know if, like, for example, the Mainz stadium, usually if those fans usually kind of bang on the cowbells a little bit. So maybe it is customized, maybe, but not in words, but in sounds. But the attention to detail is incredible. The other thing, Kartik, in that Der Klassiker too, which the Bundesliga, I think, was the first time to launch that, is as the game was going on, you had a graphic in the top left-hand corner of the screen, which was powered by AWS, Amazon Web Services.
Oh, yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. How about you explain what it was?
So basically, you start with the starting 11, and then AWS has an analytics thing that overlays that moves the players, the player number and the box they're in, or the circle they're in. It's a box actually in this graphic, to their average position at that point in the match. So you could see when, and this is for me, someone who's like a tactics geek, really important to see when guys were bunching up on the pitch. When the midfield, when the shape wasn't right, and what the average position was of each player, and when the strikers weren't properly separated, or teams that are playing like Dortmund plays a 3-4-3, if there was some sort of issue with the shape, which is just another tool for us tactics geeks. We used to have to overlay kind of Opta real time on our computers or on our phones, what was going on the screen, to get that sort of level of detail. And now the Bundesliga and AWS and Amazon Web Services have put together this really kind of cool thing, which maybe they perfected over this 2 months of the coronavirus break. And this is something we will see in other leagues going forward, which enhances your TV viewing experience, because formations are not static. This is the thing about this sport, which is a little different than, like, you put a formation in American football, and that's the formation, right? Although those formations change from play to play. Yeah. So, because they line up that way. The formations are very static. So I've gotten in the last few years into saying, yeah, they're playing a 3-5-2, but it really plays like a 4-4-1-1 at times, and trying to make these explanations. Oh, yeah, it's a 4-4-3, it's a 4-3-3, but it's really a 4-3-2-1 and types, things like that. This graphic actually visualizes that. And I think that's so important also for the commentators.
Absolutely, because it's a real time showing you their average position, and in some games it might be this isn't brand new, but in some games we might look at it and go, there's nothing much there to add. But in other games it actually can be quite telling in terms of if it looks like the team is pushing up a lot, or is defending high up the pitch, so on and so forth. Kartik, in terms of the Bundesliga, I think I asked you the question, like, was there anything negative from the coverage? And I don't think there was. The only thing I would say is that sometimes with the crowd noise, I guess either the Fox or the Bundesliga forgot to switch it on, because for some games there'd be no crowd noise for the first 10 minutes of the match, and then all of a sudden the crowd noise would go on. And some games had the noise, some games didn't. So it is kind of at random, but overall, the actual football, it seems to be getting more physical. Maybe that was just the Dusseldorf Schalke game, but it seems to be. The players seem to be fitter. The level of football is getting better week after week, and we've had some good comebacks. We've had some really close games. Week 1 from the restart was a little bit more open-ended, one-sided. Week 2 was a lot of goals flying in, but a lot of late comebacks, a lot more excitement. All right, Kartik, speaking of excitement, let's move on to TV streaming news, and NWSL is back.
Yeah, NWSL is back. They're going to start this 1-month tournament in Utah on June 27th. CBS All Access will carry all games from the tournament, and CBS will carry a match on the opening day, which is a Saturday, June 27th, and the final on July 26th. Right now, there were no matches scheduled for CBS Sports Network, though I'm advised by a source that could change, and we could have additional games on CBS over the air. Very exciting for NWSL that they're getting 2 matches on CBS over the air, which is fantastic on network television for them. However, maybe that's what is prompting this early restart. June 27th will make them the first U.S. league in what we would consider a major team sport to return. And they're going to do this in a self-contained neutral site venue in Utah. It's not really neutral site. I guess there is a team from there, the Utah Royals. But it will be not the NWSL season as originally scheduled, but a tournament. And this is similar to what MLS is planning in Florida.
Yeah, definitely good news that it's coming back. In not so good news, Liga MX, the Mexican league, has cancelled the 2020 Clausura season due to the coronavirus, and will be looking to start up the next season. I think was it August or probably August, most likely to start it up there. As far as the other leagues go, the Portuguese Premier League is coming back June 3rd. We've already mentioned La Liga. The Turkish Super League is coming back June 12th, and and then I think we've mentioned all the other leagues in terms of their return dates. Actually, except for one, and that's Major League Soccer, and that's July is the latest date. It's still TBD because going back, Kartik, I mean, a few months ago, you and I were talking on a podcast about how right now is the perfect time for Major League Soccer to be talking about the next right cycle in terms of TV. Everything was aligned perfectly in terms of this year being the 25th anniversary year. All of a sudden, there was a lot of interest from a lot of streaming platforms, including DAZN. And others. And there was also Turner was interested, BR Live was interested, as well as the TV side. Then you had the increase in number of MLS teams throughout the country, the expansion. Everything was looking positive. Then you knew that this season, later this summer, MLS was going to be having some of the games on ABC as part of doubleheaders with Euro 2020. Ticket revenue in terms of some of these attendances, for games, so Atlanta United, 50,000 fans, Seattle, 50,000 fans. That was huge. Then you had the crossover integration with Liga MX. You had this summer would have been the All-Star game. You had the Campeones Cup. You had the Leagues Cup. And then you had an increase of interest in the CONCACAF Champions League and some MLS teams being up against Liga MX teams. Everything was positive. And now from 3 months ago to now, Kartik, I mean, the Euro 2020 has been cancelled, and then there's no games on ABC unless they have some of these games in Orlando on ABC. But the All-Star game's gone, even Campeones Cup is gone, Leagues Cup is gone, so the Liga MX is gone. And also with the ticket revenue, I mean, when is the next time that you can imagine Atlanta United playing in front of a stadium of full capacity, say 50,000 fans? When is that going to happen? What's your prediction on that?
Well, that's not going to happen until next season at the earliest. I think this is kind of a two-tiered thing. I think in terms of the general kind of macro picture in terms of MLS's kind of pursuit of casual sports fans and of global football fans, this has been really unfortunate timing. This has gone very, very poorly for them, and this has hurt them because we're talking about a situation now where they have not gotten those live doubleheader games on ABC with the Euro lead-in. They've lost out on all this ticket revenue. The cross-integration with Liga MX, as you mentioned, has been shelved for this season, even though there have been all these rumors. We'll get to that in a minute about some sort of integration within the leagues, and they don't have any TV revenue, right, or virtually none compared to other top leagues. Now, what they have done is in the domestic space, they've been able to consolidate their position of power because the other domestic players, USL and NWSL, professional players, have been hurting just as much, if not more in the case of USL. And then US Soccer ran into a wall. Now, we know, and you know this especially well, Chris, with your experience in youth soccer with your daughter, etc., that the development academy had hit a wall for U.S. soccer. But sunsetting it early and allowing MLS to consolidate their position and take in a bunch of the independent clubs, tying those independent clubs who potentially could have been the rivals for MLS academies into their academy structure consolidates their position. And I think there's some weakness in USL and in NWSL. We'll see if NWSL is able to offset it with this tournament. That will allow MLS to further consolidate their hold on the domestic game in the country. However, in terms of their bigger plans, which include expansion, right? Because consolidating your soccer in the soccer space, which is relatively small in this country, isn't going to help you sell franchises for 300 or 400 million or whatever they were planning, or even get those teams in St. Louis and Charlotte, et cetera, launched on time that have already been announced. Sacramento is an existing infrastructure that can move right in, I think. But the other two, I would have some concerns if they could start on time. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's been a net negative. I would agree with you.
Yeah, but even future expansion beyond St. Louis and beyond, say, Sacramento.
Yeah, there isn't the kind of money now for people to spend on that, and they don't have the showcase that they would have had. So I think this might MLS has shown, in spite of Garber time and again saying, we're stopping at 16, we're stopping at 20, we're stopping at 24. He keeps raising the ante in terms of number of teams in the league. I think we might have a freeze for a few years now, because there just won't be there just won't be the ability to sell a team for the amount they want. And MLS is very conscious of what these sale prices are, right? So they don't want, and this isn't going to be an issue for USL, which I know we're not talking about also, but USL likes to claim certain fees and price points for clubs, which may or may not be true. I think it's the same thing with MLS. I mean, they say, it's X amount of dollars, but a lot of that includes other stuff. They're not going to be able to hit that price point for a while, is what I'm thinking. So, I agree with you. I think that this is they're going to have to sit and kind of consolidate and figure out how this consolidation of their position domestically can benefit them 5 years down the road to maybe make those big moves that they thought they were going to be making in 2021, 2022, but instead will be making around the time the World Cup is hosted again in the U.S. in 2026. So I think that they are racking their brains with this, and this goes to a story, right, Chris, that we that we have this week, which is, of course, The Athletic had a story about Garber claiming MLS hired a firm to investigate investigate leaks, and this includes actually some of these leaks that The Athletic have reported themselves. And I mentioned the Liga MX's integration. That was one of the things that MLS was freaked out about that getting out. Mm-hmm. That's part of a kind of a long-term vision, and once it got out, it was out. It was, especially with nothing else going on, Chris, it was all over Twitter for days. And similar stories. So they've hired...
Well, it's funny too, because the story about the leak was leaked to The Athletic also. Right, so Garber writes a memo and provides it to all of the clubs within Major League Soccer, saying, okay, there's an issue. The issue is that information has been leaking to the press. You need to make sure you do what you can do to stop this. Otherwise, there will be disciplinary action, i.e. getting fired. And that memo was leaked also. So on top of that, but to me, Kartik, I mean,
another thing I wanted to mention that on this Orlando tournament, there was some unhappiness that got expressed to me that I had gotten aspects of the story that weren't out there. Although I think really between Steve Goff and The Athletic, they had covered it. And I said, look, when you're talking to officials at Visit Orlando and Experience Kissimmee, and you're talking to political officials, somehow it's going to leak, and some of that got back to me. So they can't operate in a vacuum in the world they're in and expect things not to leak. So,
well, that's the thing is that they're used to operating within a vacuum in the United States, where very much, most of the MLS reporters, a lot of them write for MLSsoccer.com, so you have to say the right things, do the right things. There's very little independent coverage of MLS outside of some of the national newspapers, and even then there's not a lot there. So The Athletic is one of the few organizations that has the payroll to be able to pay independent writers to write independent stories about what's going on. And Garbo is quite upset about that being leaked to The Athletic. To me, though, Kartik, it does paint a picture. It paints a picture of panic. It paints a picture of high pressure. It paints a picture of there's a lot of things up in the air right now. Even with the Orlando tournaments that we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 podcasts on this, that still hasn't been completely firmed up. And you've got NBA that is also trying to get in there too. So it's a race against time. At the same time, though, Kartik, is the CBA. So the Players Union and Major League Soccer agreed on a CBA, collective bargaining agreement, a few months ago. And because of the coronavirus, when that happened, that hasn't been ratified. That has not been completely 100% signed all the way. So that's another issue too, where Garber, I think in today's media, is said, okay, I'm going to give 72 hours to the Players Union to sit down with them and haggle out all the terms, so we can agree to something, so that we can move forward with this Orlando tournament, because that's still up in the air.
Yeah, and I want to point out, for those who may have forgotten this, that the last time there was a lot of talk that the players had caved in 2015, the previous CBA, on the CBA. But when it went for ratification, there were 6 player reps. There were only 20 teams in Orlando in the league then. 6 player reps voted no. I know a few of them, actually, and there was some hedging among those that voted yes. It was a 14-6 vote, but so the players union, certain club representatives have not been in unanimity necessarily with the strategy of the players union leadership in the past. This now makes it higher stakes because they're being asked for pay cuts. They're being asked to risk their health and safety, right, in a tournament in the middle of coronavirus, albeit in kind of closed doors tournament. And I will mention to you that there is one agency in particular that has a lot of control over the players union, and players who are represented by other agents don't necessarily see the same thing in terms of what they want from a collective bargaining agreement. So the idea that this could be hammered out quickly and the Orlando tournament will be announced, maybe it happens. But I tend to think it's more complicated, and that's why we have not seen an announcement. There are some certain elements within that players union that are holding firm, and this I am very surprised we didn't see this in NWSL. By the way, I was expecting it. I had been telling people privately the same thing was going to happen. I've been talking to people privately and saying this was going to happen in both places, and it has happened in MLS. Whereas NWSL was able to go forward, and I've heard nothing about players saying they're not going to go, et cetera, which is quite surprising. When MLS announces this, Chris, there will be somebody like Troy Deeney, like Danny Rose, who says, you know what, I don't know if I want to do this. So that's another thing they're going to grapple with, and then that will leak, and they'll be upset again.
Yeah, but I think it will still move forward, though. So the ball will be rolling by that point.
Oh, yeah.
And if players say, like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, then, hopefully there's an opportunity for them to bow out. Whether they get paid or not, that's a whole other story. But with this, though, Kartik, MLS Commissioner Don Garber has been through a lot in his role as Commissioner of Major League Soccer. And this is, I would say, his number one most difficult challenge, because you're getting attacked from all sides. So from the bottom end, as far as talking about taking over a lot of these development academy teams. Yeah, so from the lower end, from youth soccer, there's more overhead. Now you have all these clubs. At the same time, too, in terms of parents and clubs, it's going to be more challenging for them to sign players and for parents to pay thousands of dollars or a little bit less in some areas. Some of the academies probably there wouldn't be a fee for, but there's and less likelihood that parents will want their children to be traveling around the United States playing games in all sorts of hotspots in different areas. So that's on the bottom end. On the top end, the attendance, Kartik, that is a huge issue, because you look at, say, I asked you before about Atlanta United. When will the next time they'll be able to get 50,000 fans in the stadium? And I think you said next year, but it could take a couple of years. It could be that once things are opened up and fans.
I said at the earliest next year, by the way.
At the earliest, yeah.
3 or 4 years.
So, And that's the thing, though, too, is the attendance and gate revenue has been the main driver of revenue for Major League Soccer, other than expansion fees. And we've talked about how expansion fees could be in jeopardy in the future as far as future ones. So, but the reality, we go back to the TV revenue, and it's the TV revenue more than anything that is going to make or break Major League Soccer, because you look at how much money they're bringing in currently under the current deal, and it's approximately $90 million a year. Now, you look at the Bundesliga, just as one example of a major league, but not the top league, but a major league. Within Germany alone, the Bundesliga brings in over $1 billion in revenue. So there's a huge gap between the two sides. And I think it's this TV deal, this next TV deal, which doesn't come up until 2022, is going to be massive. And I'm thinking, Kartik, is that I wouldn't be surprised if Major League Soccer has been sitting down trying to figure out, is there a way we can do this deal, end this deal early with kind of a guarantee from ESPN and Fox, kind of a long-term relationship. Let's extend this from 2022 all the way through to 2026. Let's start trying to figure out if we can do a deal now in order to bring that money in now. Have that money coming in and bump up the actual the value of those rights. I wouldn't be surprised if those discussions are being had, or at least have been had with some other players trying to figure out is a way that we can do this deal early and get more revenue. But
there's kind of an acknowledged. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, but the most important thing is to get back and actually playing games, which is why that pressure's on the Orlando tournament to make that happen. Because without that tournament happening, without games being played, effectively MLS is invisible. MLS ceases to exist. So games need to happen. Orlando needs to happen. The sooner the better. Just to give MLS an opportunity, some leverage to talk about, okay, let's talk about the future. Let's talk about future TV deals. What can we do today to sign a long-term agreement, to be a long-term partner, which then excludes the DAZNs, which DAZN's in trouble too, because DAZN, the owner, the billionaire that has the majority stake in DAZN, is looking at possibly selling the company or looking for more investment. So they're scrambling. DAZN, if things keep on heading the way they're heading, they could be out of business in the near future. But you do have YouTubes, you do have your Amazons, you do have these other players, but they're being impacted too. But I think now is really much a make or break time for Major League Soccer, and a lot of it is what happens in Orlando. That this has to happen.
Yeah, I think in terms of the youth soccer space, you mentioned that. I actually talked to a number of people who tell me that that's a defensive move also because of what you mentioned, travel. Parents do not want their kids traveling all over the place. And MLS had launched a separate academy league without kind of filling in the gaps on the map with independent clubs. They would have been in that position, and that's a COVID reaction. So that was when I said, well, that's a move of strength. People told me, no, it's actually a move of weakness. They preempted the weakness, but it's a defensive move because parents like yourself, Chris, don't want their kids getting on a bus in Atlanta and going all the way to Washington, D.C. or to Nashville, right? They want clubs. Atlanta might be a bad example because they didn't really fill in the map there. But in Florida, let's say, Orlando and Miami, Fort Lauderdale, there are now tons of independent clubs that have filled out the MLS lit map. So the Orlando Academy kids will never have to go to Atlanta. So they'll never have to leave the state. That's why they did it. So you're absolutely right. What appeared, and they sold as a move of strength, and I thought was a move of strength, I then got multiple sources pushing back saying, hey, yeah, it probably long-term will work out for them, but they had to do it because of this. So, you're on the money on that. Yeah,
we haven't actually talked much about that either, though, too. But I saw it more as a power play for MLS to establish themselves as an even more powerful body within the United States, as opposed to the U.S. Soccer Federation. And you go back to SOM's the Soccer United Marketing. It's the marketing arm of Major League Soccer that does a lot of deals with U.S. Soccer and the Mexican Federation too. And this week you had one of the representatives from the FMF in Mexico saying that they have no interest in playing Mexican friendlies in the United States in the near future. And the reason why, and these are events that are hosted and run by Soccer United Marketing, is because they can't guarantee that there'll be any fans in the stadium. And then the only reason that Mexico is playing these friendlies in the United States far more than in Mexico is because of the money. So Soccer United Marketing is going to get
that's a huge
hit on that side too. Huge. Yeah, it's hard to see any positives in any of this, so Kartik. I mean, this is having dramatic financial impacts across all leagues and confederations. Even in the Caribbean and CONCACAF, there's been talks about some of the countries' national teams not having enough money to go ahead and even compete in the next World Cup qualifying. And at the end of the day, I mean, for me personally, I want to see Major League Soccer survive. I want to see it continue to grow. As with, NISA, USL, all the different leagues, it's important, and youth soccer too. It's important that organizations are available for players to play and for fans to go watch games. But we're at jeopardy here of the whole thing really kind of the foundation breaking. So it is troubling times, and hopefully something will change soon. Kartik, one more news item before we move on to TV ratings, and that's Newcastle United. Some doubts there.
Yeah, so obviously we've talked a lot about BOutQ on this podcast, and the Newcastle takeover is now in serious doubt as the WTO rules that the pirated TV channel is in fact Saudi, something we knew, right? We have known all along. But this puts that in serious doubt. There's also an issue, obviously, of Sheffield United's ownership that is kind of tangentially related to this. So we'll have to keep an eye on that as well.
Yeah, so it could be beIN Sports, which is the troublemaker here, which was, I don't blame them. They were the ones that have been on this huge campaign in the last 12 to 18 months, trying to publicize and trying to let people know that BOutQ, which was in the beginning taking beIN Sports' TV feeds from Qatar and pirating them and making them available worldwide so anyone could watch them, undermining beIN Sports, undermining Qatar. And it was really a Middle Eastern, kind of a battle, a war in some ways in the Middle East. But here we go. Now it goes to Newcastle. So, and the Premier League is in a very difficult position in terms of trying to figure out how to get through this one unscathed. Next up is TV ratings, and we won't go into a lot of detail. We will have all of the numbers at worldsoccertalk.com. But looking at week 2 of the Bundesliga compared to week 1, week 2 dropped on the English language side by approximately about 17%. In some ways, though, too, these numbers do not include the Klassiker from Tuesday, so we'll get those numbers soon, probably Thursday, and we'll publish those on worldsoccertalk.com too. But overall, the biggest number on the English language side was Bayern Munich against Frankfurt. God, Frankfurt's horrible. On FS1 on Saturday from 12:30 to 2:30, and that was 303,000 viewers for that one. So positives there. Just I was still thinking before 2 weeks ago that these numbers would be much greater. That sports fans, and soccer fans would be craving sports a lot more, and would be. These numbers would be much greater than what they are, and they are so much greater than what they were before. But times have changed. All right, listener mailbag. First up is Bill Reese. Bill says, I wanted to voice my support for Fox's use of canned noise in the Bundesliga games this past weekend. Obviously, this is not football as it's meant to be, but nothing in this pandemic is as it's meant to be. The return of some live sports is a welcome distraction from the awful news that permeates all aspects of our daily lives. The silence in the first round of Bundesliga games served only as a reminder that while sports were back, everything was still wrong. I found the piped-in noise to be comforting. For a few moments, I almost felt like it was a regular Sunday morning of German football. I know it wasn't, but I was more than willing to suspend my disbelief. I hope Fox continues it, and I hope ESPN Plus is paying close attention to the fans' reaction to these audio effects. And I completely agree, 100% there with Bill. Some great feedback. Next up is Rico Richardson talking about the last podcast, to reflect on the time of the Bundesliga and the time that they had on Fox. You kind of have to blame the league too. They didn't pitch in with a lot of effort to market their league in the US, even with Americans over that time. And that's something I completely disagree with 100%. Just from being a journalist and talking to the Bundesliga receiving press releases and information from the Bundesliga on a weekly basis and having opportunities for interviews and learning more about what they're doing on the marketing side and the advertising side. They have done more than any other league, other than Major League Soccer. They have done more than any other league in the United States to promote themselves. So we saw this past weekend too. With they have their commercials, which is an absolutely fantastic commercial where it talks about football as it's meant to be, and it really sums up the passion and what makes the Bundesliga different. And that's something, that's just one example of I mean, they have weekly newsletters with tons of interviews and information that goes out to the press. They've done advertising campaigns. I remember back in 2015, 2016, they were doing advertising, not just on Fox, but even in websites and other websites promoting the Bundesliga. So I disagree there too with Rico in terms of everything that they've done. JP says on the last episode, come on, you can't rail against Fox for almost the entire podcast for things like using the world feed, lack of promotion, no halftime or post-game analysis, and inconsistent channels, FS1 or FS2, and in the same breath proclaim how ESPN is going to treat them so much better. If you look at any of the properties on ESPN Plus, there is the following: world feed, no halftime or post-game analysis. Sometimes a halftime promo or end-of-match recap from the world feed is overtaken by commercials. So let me just interject there just for a split second. And that's the thing that too, with ESPN Plus, even though they're basic world feed that we do get halftime highlights of the goals. So if you're watching the Bundesliga and you miss the first half for whatever reason, and you miss some of the action of goals, you will not see that at halftime. You will not see that at post-match. But with the bare minimum on ESPN Plus, you will see that at halftime. You will see that post-match. You will see the goals there. Let me go ahead and continue. In the case of Serie A, where there is at least one match on television, the time slot isn't consistent. Can be 6 a.m. on a Saturday one week, and then noon Eastern on the Sunday the next, and so on. Then there's the rotating channel, but most often the game is on ESPN News, which is carried at a lower rate than ESPN or ESPN2. When on TV, there is no bumper programming to speak of. Match coverage 10 minutes before kickoff begins after whatever show preceded it. As for promotion, minimal to non-existent. As a Serie A fan, you'd think I'd always know what the match of the week is, but numerous times I'm on ESPN Plus looking for a particular match, then I finally realize I can't find it because it must be on television. My viewing on ESPN Plus is 95% Serie A with some Eredivisie. However, the email notifications I received weekly for things to watch always highlighted college sports and UFC first. When it finally gets to soccer, it's usually during a weekend with FA Cup or League Cup matches. Serie A is an afterthought. With the Bundesliga joining and only getting 4 matches on television for the entire season, what makes you think that ESPN is going to promote it any better than Fox did? For those issues that with the lack of promotions and random schedule for pre-game coverage, Fox's coverage of the Bundesliga will have done more to gain awareness than ESPN will. And I'll pause there. So the one thing in speaking with the Bundesliga and speaking to some of my sources, there was discussion of having the Bundesliga and ESPN work together on a 30 for 30 type of programming. It might not be a 30 for 30 documentary, but they have focused. They've said publicly, that they want to go ahead and talk more about the stories, talk about more of the players and what makes the Bundesliga special. And that's something that we haven't gotten from Fox. Oftentimes, if it is any of those types of promos, it's been the Bundesliga that's been providing that content. So a 30 for 30 is just one example of something that ESPN could do that could really highlight the story of the Bundesliga, which is a really fascinating story. But in terms of Serie A, yeah. I mean, it's not the most popular league, but there are things that could be improved about the way that ESPN is broadcasting the Serie A, and a lot of it comes down to communication. So good points there, JP. All right. Next up is Jared.
I would point out one thing real quickly, Chris, is that I agree with JP on his points about ESPN Plus and them often mailing it in coverage. However, more recently, and we were seeing this trend, and I was actually covering it before coronavirus struck, there had been more halftime shows, post-game shows integrating the ESPN FC crew and more kind of native commentaries with Mark Donaldson and Matteo Bonetti on big matches from Serie A and also FA Cup, League Cup type matches. So I think they were beginning to move in the other direction. Your criticism is well taken for the first 2 years of ESPN Plus, but I think we began to see this change in February of 2020, and then in March of 2020, everything stopped. So I'm not sure where they pick up, if they revert or after this, because obviously everybody's financially hurting, including Disney and ESPN, or if they continue that progression, which would put them in a different territory than where Fox has left the Bundesliga.
That's a good point, Kartik, too, because where will Serie A be after ESPN starts showing ESPN Plus? Will Serie A get knocked down in the totem pole and have less time and attention? Or will there be some crossover between the Bundesliga and Serie A in terms of trying to up the just not only the quantity but also the quality of coverage and giving more love to the Serie A than what they have done in the past before? I mean, this whole coronavirus has screwed everything up, but there was talk about sending, I think, some of the commentators from ESPN to some of the games at the end of the season for Serie A. Because, I mean, remember, right before the coronavirus hit, Serie A was the league that had the best title race. It was completely wide open. It was like, okay, Inter's playing really well, Juventus, and Atalanta looked really good. It was the talking point.
Lazio.
Yeah, Lazio. It was the talking point of world soccer. The focus was, and actually ESPN FC was talking a lot more about, Inter especially, and that went out the window, so everything changed. Jared says Fox is going to all live bowling in prime time on over-the-air network on both June 6th and June 13th. Fox putting bowling over Bundesliga and probably over MLS if it was back. Dave Roberts says, when this MLS Disney tournament gets started, the ratings will be low if it's on regular ESPN because millions of people cancelled live TV. If they wanted eyeballs on the games, it must be on a streaming service like ESPN Plus. And we talked a few weeks ago, too, about the K-League and how much interest there was when the news broke incorrectly from one of the UK publications that ESPN Plus was positioned to acquire the rights. And when we did find out that the rights actually ended up with 11 Sports, nobody seemed to care. And there is a lot. There's a lot to that. The ESPN Plus. You mention ESPN Plus in anything, and people are loving it. They're like, "Oh my gosh, it's so exciting! This is great, wonderful news! Finally, thank you." And I think a lot of it is because of the low price point, but the number of people that actually have it, they're craving content, especially on the soccer side. Last but not least, Monty Reed says, as I sit here watching the K-League on 11 Sports on Fubo TV, I recorded the match, so I'm watching it a few hours delayed without knowing the score. There is no commentary on the match, so Fox can go lower by omitting the world feed. So, and that goes to last week's podcast where we talked about how low can Fox go. Well, I guess 11 Sports and the K-League can go a step below and not have any commentary at all. One last thing, Kartik, before we let listeners know where to send in the feedback is on Wednesday night, ESPN2 televised a game from Costa Rica. It was the Deportivo Saprissa, and it had, I think, Adrian Healy and Alejandro. Alejandro were doing the commentary on this, Moreno. So it looks like ESPN is, I guess, desperate. I think we're all desperate for soccer coverage, but now they're showing Costa Rican soccer at 10 o'clock at night, and that's likely to continue. I would think. All All right, listeners, this has been a long episode, so I appreciate you sticking with us. We went through a lot. There was a lot to cover. As you can tell, it is a very pivotal time in really the history of soccer. I mean, this is going to go into the history books, Kartik. I'm going to see a David Goldblatt in future generations. I mean, maybe David Goldblatt Jr., writing about the 2020 pandemic and the impact that it had on global sports and specifically soccer. And I think the worst is not over yet in terms of even just the impact on soccer. We'll have to wait and see what that happens. But we want you to have your say, whether you have questions, feedback, comments, ideas about streaming, television coverage, anything. You can always reach us via email through web at worldsoccertalk.com, as well as facebook.com/worldsoccertalk, and on Twitter at worldsoccertalk. Plus, of course, you can always post your comments on worldsoccertalk.com. And listeners, thank you so much for your feedback and letters and emails and comments and tweets, etc., because we really do appreciate it. And you guys are the ones that drive this show forward. And we usually read out every comment we get, whether it's positive, negative, or indifferent. We do value your feedback. All right, Kartik, so to tie things up, what are you doing this weekend? What are you going to be watching?
I'm going to be watching a lot of Bundesliga and enjoying my football.
Okay. All the best. Cheers.